Well, good morning or good evening or whenever you're watching this. My name is Clark Cavan. I'm the other Dr. Cavan. Uh, as most of you know, uh, Dr. Lisa Cavan had her knee replaced on Thursday, and she's doing well, but she's on drugs. So she asked if I would step in and do this for her. We are talking about behavior, and Lisa and I actually met in a doctoral program at the University of North Texas. My specialty is emotional and behavioral disorders, where hers was learning disabilities evaluation, that kind of thing. So she often gets me to step in and add a little on these, or especially in a situation like this. So I'm looking forward to it, and we'll just jump right in. Make sure I get the right file opened. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing my screen there. And if this doesn't work correctly, we'll just do it again because nobody's here right now. So that makes it easy. All right, so we're in chapter 7, looking at students with emotional and behavior disorders out of the Maryland Friend special education book. Learning objectives, y'all can go over that. Development of the field of EBD, and let's talk about that EBD for a minute. Emotional and behavior disorders is what that stands for. Whenever I was going to school, they always used the term EDBD, which is emotional disturbance behavior disorder. But my professor was always talking about these EDBD kids. And when you have trouble with these EDBD kids, I'm like, if you got trouble with the EDBD kid, pick him up, move him, do whatever you need to do. Um, this is a problematic term, the EBD or the EDBD, because we don't use that. It's not in IDEA. It's not in the Texas laws. What we have is emotional disturbance. But for some reason, everybody in academia throws the D in there. And, even when I told you what I did a while ago, I told you that I work with emotionally and behaviorally disordered kids. So it's out there, but don't let that throw you off. There is no EBD in the state of Texas or in IDEA for a classification. The term is emotionally disturbed, and it's ED. They're pointing out that until the early 20th century, 1904, is the first book that came out on looking at children with emotional problems. There's a lot of factors that make this a challenge to study. There's not a consistent set of terms. It's kind of one of those things when you see a kid that's got emotional disturbances, you kind of know it, but there are other things that can look that way as well. Sometimes it's a mental illness, sometimes intellectual disability thrown together. So lots of issues in even trying to name this and identify students who belong in this category. We're having more of a gradual understanding of causes, identification, and development of interventions, but it's only really been last 50 years or so that we've really taken a hard look at this. I remember when I started working with these sorts of kids, my grandpa asked me, aren't there reform schools anymore? As a kid, they put every kid in a reform school that didn't know how to act. And that's kind of the general thought of it, that they don't know how to act. And some of it that is that they don't know how to act. Others of it, it's that they know how to act, they just don't want to. So we'll look at all of those issues here for a little bit. Under the IDEA definition of emotional disturbance, the term schizophrenia is included, but it excludes social maladjustment. However, it says that these students who have emotional disturbance are not socially maladjusted unless the social maladjustment is a result of the emotional disturbance. So it's a cyclical thing that is really hard to nail down. But they do have one or more of the following over a long period of time to a marked degree, and it adversely affects educational performance. I mean, we can see how wishy-washy this is when we look at over a long period of time. How long is that? And to a marked degree, how much is that? An inability to learn that can't be otherwise explained. So we've ruled out all the other disability categories. Inability to build or maintain relationships. And this is an interesting one for a court case that they had. A student that the school said had emotional disturbances could not get along with peers, but they did great around adults. They built relationships with the adults, and so the parents said, this kid has emotional disturbance, and the district said, no, they don't. They can maintain relationships. Well, he doesn't have any peers that are friends. Well, that doesn't really matter. They are maintaining relationships, and that's what this is asked about. Inappropriate types of behavior or expressions of feelings. And, when you get into that, what is an inappropriate behavior? I mean, it's one that I don't like, right? If it's not appropriate for me, it may be appropriate for someone else. Now, one of the things that I always talk about when we look at kids with emotional behavioral disorders is this whole idea of normal. And we've all heard the saying, normal's only a setting on a washing machine. And there's some truth to that when we look at behavior, because some of the behaviors that we think are inappropriate are what keeps some of the kids alive on the street. Pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. And this is a situation where, there's not a reason. Certainly if your grandmother just passed away, you have a reason to be unhappy. Your girlfriend just dumped you. You have a reason to be depressed. But if this goes on, my mother was a teacher. We actually taught in the same school, both in special education at one point. Some people say, "Oh, I wouldn't want to work with my mom." Well, I thought it was great because she always brought lunch, good deal. But this had a student, and he started crying in class one time. She said, "Oh, Chris, what's wrong?" And he said, "Well, my grandmother died, and I'm really sad." And she said, "Well, go see the counselor." So the counselor came to my mother later and said, his grandmother did die. And she said, "Yeah, I'm so sorry about that." And he said, "Well, it was 6 years ago." So obviously starting to cry in class because thinking about your grandmother who died 6 years ago is not really normal. So then you start looking, is this a pervasive thing? Physical symptoms or fears associated with personal and school problems. This is where your schizophrenia comes in, where we've got fears that are, not based in reality. Sometimes it might be, I had a kid who thought everybody in the cafeteria was laughing at him. Somebody would tell a joke way across the cafeteria, and he would go to pick a fight because he was sure they were laughing at him when they didn't even know he was in the cafeteria, So that kind of thing can happen. There's a criticism of this definition, or a lot of criticisms of this definition. It says the 5 criteria are not supported by research. I think that, we all like to use research to make it say what we wanted to say. So I think it's hard to make that blanket statement that there's not any research supporting any of these criteria. I think that there is a lot, but people will say, well, it's not good research or not evidence-based and that kind of thing. Education performance focused too much on academic learning and excluding the social curriculum. We do get into this a lot with the kids with emotional and behavioral disorders. Teachers want to teach their content. And, if I've got this one kid who's constantly misbehaving and you want me to teach him how to behave while I've got all these other kids, if this kid's included in my general ed classroom? And then you get parents, you get teachers saying things like, well, that's the parents' problem, not mine, so this is a tough one. Schools now, especially urban schools, spend a lot of time working on social emotional learning. The thing is, these kids they're not going to get it. They haven't gotten it in all the years during school. They're not going to get it through something like that. So they need something more. This whole exclusion of socially maladjusted is confusing because students with conduct disorders make up the largest group of those with emotional behavior disorders. And that makes most of those who are socially maladjusted. So there's so much overlap, yet it can't be the root for the diagnosis. So this will continue to evolve. The whole category of emotional disturbance has changed. When IDEA was authorized, I believe it was a 1990 reauthorization, they actually, before that time, had autism in the definition of emotionally disturbed, and they made it its own category. So it will continue to evolve. The thing is that the IDEA was supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years, every 10 years, and it's been a long time since it's been reauthorized. So I think when it does come that we will see some changes, but who knows what those will be and who knows when it will happen. The National Coalition on Mental Health and Special Education defines emotional disturbance or emotional behavior disorders as behavioral or emotional responses so different from appropriate age, cultural, or ethnic norms that they adversely affect educational performance. So here we have instead of marked difference, we have so different from that it affects their education. So we may be headed to something the right direction there when we're bringing the educational affect into it. This is more than a temporary expected response to stressful events, like we're talking about if your grandmother died or you're in a car wreck, something that was stressful, your parents' divorce. Certainly those are normal feelings and consistently exhibited in two different settings, one of which is school. So this may be a situation. I know after our divorce, with my first wife, Lisa's my new and improved wife, but before, my ex-wife called me and she said, hey, Caroline, who's one of our daughters, is having a lot of anger issues. And I said, oh, really? And she said, yeah. And Caroline was living with me. And I said, well, I'm not seeing any of that. And she said, well, I'm seeing it here at my house. And I'm sure they're seeing a lot of it at school. So I made an appointment with the school counselor and went up and talked to the school counselor about these anger issues my daughter was having. And she said, we're not seeing any anger issues. So these anger issues were only happening when she was at her mom's house. And, we were all pretty mad at her mom, so it was understandable. But if you're going to have this unusual behavioral or emotional responses, needs to be in more than one setting, and one of those must be the school. And then thirdly, unresponsive to direct intervention in general education. So this is where the whole RTI method would be put in place to help this child. And it may be RTI for behavior as well as RTI for academics. This can coexist with other disabilities. You could have an emotional disturbance and have a physical disability, or you could be blind, or you could have a learning disability. So there's a lot of things that go in here that right now the definition seems to exclude, like the learning disability part, because this is a learning disability an academic problem that can't be attributed to something else, like a learning disability. may include schizophrenia, affective disorders, anxiety disorder, or conduct disorders. So, the question is, if we go with this definition, does ADHD start coming under this rather than another health impairment? So there's lots of things on the horizon to look for. Medical perspective, we look at disruptive, impulsive control, conduct disorders. We usually call this oppositional defiant disorder, mood disorders, persistent depressive disorder, feeding and eating disorders like anorexia nervosa and some of the others. So these are some medical perspectives that classify as a mental disorder that could also indicate an emotional disturbance. As far as prevalence, 6.3% of all students in special education have or are identified as having an emotional disturbance. African American students are identified more than twice as often as students overall. It's estimated that 1 in 5 adolescents has a mental health disorder. Half of all adult mental illness begins before 14. Boys, it's 3 to 4 times more likely to occur than in girls, but girls are probably under-identified. So if we look at all this, African American students, people would argue, well, they should behave on the same norm as the general population. Yet we have twice as many of them. So it must be a cultural thing that we don't understand their behaviors, and there could be something to that. We don't really know. There's been a lot of research done on the over-identification of African Americans into special ed and into the category of emotionally and behavior disordered. But is that a problem, or is this real, or is it racism? It's going to continue to be an issue. If it's estimated that 1 in 5 adolescents has a mental disorder, then you would think at least 20% of all kids would be in special education. Well, that's not the case. But people who do end up with mental illness, it usually begins before 14. I was talking to a mother the other day, and her child is bipolar and has some other things going on. And they said with everything added up, her child has about a 50% chance of committing suicide before adulthood. So that's how powerful our statistics have gotten on looking at this. Found in boys 3 to 4 times more than girls. It's pretty rare to find a girl who is listed as having an emotional disturbance. And part of that is the way that students act out. Boys tend to have these externalizing behaviors where they do bad things. Girls tend to have internalizing behaviors where they have bad thoughts, or they sit in the back and they don't really cause problems, but they're not really with us either. And what's going on in their heads is probably pretty scary. So a lot of this reason, because let's face it, unfortunately part of why many kids get placed in special education is behavior, and schools attempt to control and to keep them out of the classes with other people. Not calling any particular schools out, it just has happened over the years that way. There are other factors that may contribute. Heredity. Sometimes you meet the parents, you're like, oh yeah, I get it now. Could be a brain injury, oftentimes with prenatal problems, toxins, poor nutrition, or an accident. I had one girl, and the dad beat the mom while the child was in utero, and caused her to have all sorts of issues when she was born. Psychosocial, chronic stress at home, stressful life events, childhood maltreatment, other factors like this. One of the girls that I had, her mother was a working prostitute, and that's the house she grew up in. Um, Others, had a kid that when he was a toddler, they would wrap him up in a blanket and put him on a shelf in the closet and say, if you move, you will fall off and probably kill you. So sit up there and be good. Um, they come from life events that most of us can't understand. But when you look at this whole category, there are lots of kids who have chronic stress at home and other issues who don't develop emotional disturbances. So, it's not something that we understand. Correlated constraints are risk factors that promote constrained development of positive adjustments. And they get into that whole idea of what we're talking about with resilience. Why do two kids who grow up in basically the same environment and one can't handle it and the other is a success? So lots of factors that can contribute. We don't have all the answers. We don't have many of the answers at this point. We know that poor parenting and drugs and all of that is playing into it, but we don't have the answers yet. We talked a little bit about internalizing behavior, withdrawal, and easy to overlook. This is more common with the females, where externalizing behavior, aggression, and acting out, it's easier to see. And this is probably why boys are identified at 3 to 4 times the rate that girls are. Social characteristics: anxiety, fears, anger, aggression, low self-esteem, depression, problems with social relationships. So what we've typically done is we have been very good about teaching academics using direct teach methods. I will show you what we're going to do. I will demonstrate it. I will explain it. I will help you do it on your own for a little bit, maybe even do it with a partner for a while. And then eventually I will turn you loose to do it. Yet with behaviors, we are reluctant to do that. Well, that's the parent's job or whatever. So we don't teach social skills. Well, that's a real issue for kids with emotional behavior disorders. It's also a pretty big issue for kids with learning disabilities because they don't tend to pick up on social skills and social cues just by osmosis like most kids do. They may need to be taught these things directly. We can also put in place things to help the social relationships. We also need to put in things to help handle the anxiety, the fear, the anger, the aggression, and the self-esteem, the depression issues. But again, I get it. Schools are places for academic learning more than they are to help one kid get better. So it's a tough balance. The academic and cognitive characteristics of our students is that for the most part, they are in the average cognitive ability. Could be in the low average, the high average. It's interesting, the kids with emotional disturbances have the highest cognitive ability of any of our disability categories, but they have the worst post-school outcomes. We have research showing that our kids do very well. Our kids with emotional behavior disorders do very well in 2 settings after high school. One is prison, and the other is the military. They, if they're in a very structured environment like that, where somebody's doing their thinking for them, their discipline for them, all that, they tend to do very well there. Significant academic difficulties, and this can vary by settings. As we said, they're smart kids. They ought to be able to get it. But one of the problems is that they have spent so much time out of the classroom. Go sit in the hall, go over to the principal's office. You've done that. Okay, you're going to go home for 3 days. You're going to be in school suspension for 2 weeks. And whatever the situation is, they're out of class. They're missing out on all that instruction. They come back into class. They don't know what's going on. The teacher calls on them. It's always better to be funny or bad than to be dumb. So they will give a funny or a bad response, and they get sent back out. So again, they are out of the instruction. So they're having academic difficulties because they're flat just not getting the teaching that all the other kids are getting, because they're out of the classroom so much because of their disruptive behaviors. They are at a high risk for dropping out of school. So is it one of those things where the emotional behavior disorders cause academic problems or vice versa? To me, I think the biggest issue is missing so much instruction because they're having their behaviors dealt with. And as we said, it's often comorbid with other disabilities. As far as assessing, there are all sorts of scales and behavior ratings. There are cognitive ability and achievement tests that can be given. The behavior ratings, usually those will, or behavior scales, those will usually be given to the teachers and the parent, and then those are compared against the norms. Classroom rating scales, observation, or curriculum based measures are all out there and can help add to the triangulation of the data. Family and developmental history, you want to get a good history of the family. What did this kid grow up in? That sort of thing. Any medical issues, and then look at strengths-based, measuring social emotional strengths, characteristics that give confidence, traits that help cope with adversity. So when we're looking at the eligibility criteria, does the student have one or more of the characteristics, of those 5 characteristics that we looked at? Do those characteristics adversely affect the educational performance? Can you rule out social maladjustment as the sole cause of the student's behavior problems? So those are some of the issues that you get in trying to identify students with emotional behavior disorders. In early childhood education, we want to reduce risk factors, educate young women about the effects of prenatal alcohol, nicotine, and drug use. All of these things can cause emotional and other sorts of issues within the brain of the developing child, and he's born without much of a chance, unfortunately. We need to teach parenting skills. We need to work with the parents on improving parent-child relationship. Long periods of neglect, all of those kinds of things can lead to further issues with these students as they get older. So we want to work on those sorts of things. The parenting skills continues as the child beyond the early childhood education. Many parents kind of give up, say, well, I'm having this problem with this child at school. Every time I tell them to do their work, they won't do it, and they smart off and they cuss. And you, do you see any of that kind of issue at home? The parent says, no, we don't have any of those issues at home. So, well, what are their chores? What are their jobs that they're expected to do? Oh, I don't expect them to do anything. They go in their room and play their video games. Well, then of course you don't have any problems with them. We need to work on those skills. Providing early intervention services, pre-correction, increased instructional pacing, increased rate of praise, giving specific feedback and error correction. Hey, quit being bad. Don't act ugly. That's the kind of thing we say when we need to say, when I ask you to do your math and you roll your eyes, then that's showing disrespect. So even though you don't like the assignment, sometimes we got to do things we don't like. So next time that I give you a math assignment, don't roll your eyes. Just, yes, ma'am, and go ahead and open up your book, and let's get started. Now, let me give you a chance to practice. So I've given very specific feedback. I've told them what they should do instead, and then we'll give them an opportunity to correct the rules or correct the behavior. Implementing clear classroom rules. There's so many things that we do in class, and so many teachers do them differently. Now, when you're in first grade and you have one teacher all day long, and this is what you expect, that's easy. When you start going to specials and you have other teachers, then things become a problem. You get to middle school and you have 8 different teachers, and there's no national policy on pencil sharpening. So what's the process? I've got some teachers that say, "Oh, I have a thing of new pencils," and you bring an old pencil, take a new pencil, everything's good. Well, I used to do that before COVID, but now I wash them all beforehand, and so we don't do that. Yeah, you can have a pencil as long as you leave me something like a shoe or something, so I know that I'll get it back. Oh, I expect everyone to have their own pencils, and if you don't have it, then you're in trouble, and we'll call your mom, that kind of thing. In others, as long as nobody's talking, you can get up and sharpen your pencil anytime you want to. My pencil sharpener doesn't get used anytime after the bell rings. You have to sharpen your pencil before the bell rings. And if you don't have one, then you better borrow from something. We can go on and on with all the different rules for um, how you sharpen your pencil. How do you take up papers? What do you have to have? Do you need to have your Chromebook every day in my class, or do we need to have paper and pencil? That sort of thing. And then we need collaboration between the professionals and the families. And by the time these kids are up into secondary schools, parents have pretty well given up. Either you fix them or, I'm just turning them loose. But when they're younger, then that really is important. I mean, it's important when they're older if you can get that done as well. But the stress of having a student like this, or the stress of the family that causes a student like this, there are very few of these students who are in the traditional mom, dad, brother, sister family. Most of these are in single parent or grandparent type homes, and which came first. But collaboration and communication between the school and the home is vital. So let's look at it. 44% of our students who have emotional disturbances are in general ed classes 80% of the time. About 20% are in a self-contained class, while about 18% are in separate schools or a separate facility. So you want to have that continuum of services available where we have something other than the general ed classroom and the jail to help these kiddos. There's great variation by state, and the services that they receive vary hugely depending on what school they're in, what district they're in, whether that's a priority there. There are some in day treatment or a residential program. The class that I taught in when I began my career was a day treatment classroom where they took the 10 worst special ed kids in the entire district, which was some 70,000 kids, and bused them to my room. So there are those sorts of things. There are also residential programs that a school can pay to have a student sent to. Chicago was sending their kids with these emotional behavioral needs to a school in Arizona, a residential program in Arizona. And so who knows what the cost of that was, but those things have been tried with varying degrees of success. So all of these are out there. If we talk about a Texas Youth Commission facility, clearly that's not something the school chooses. That's done by adjudication through the court system. So when we look at those sorts of things, that's not part of the school decision, but sometimes it does end up being a pretty good placement for these kiddos to get rehabilitated and get some real life training. All right, concerns about inclusive practices. curriculum may put too much pressure on the student, and there's no social skills development or anger management going on if we're all academic based, is one of the criticisms about inclusion for our kiddos. Social rejection is likely to occur. General education teachers are more negative about these students than those with other disabilities. And, let's face it, this kid makes your classroom hell. I mean, it's tough. These are kids that are not easy to like. So yeah, they don't make friends. I mean, we saw that's one of the characteristics. They don't have good social relationships, social skills, not easy to like. For the other kids, they're often mean to the other kid, and the other kids are mean back to them. It's tough. And then mental health treatment, it's hard to incorporate that into the classroom. It could be that we take them out 30 minutes a week to go talk to the counselor or something like that. How much difference is that really going to make? Sometime in younger kiddos, they will deal with the whole class. A counselor will come in and we'll talk, and people will say, "Oh no, that's not fair to Johnny. You're validating his rights by telling these kids that there's something wrong with him." They already know. I mean, they've seen it. They understand. Certainly, we don't have to give medical diagnoses or anything like that would violate HIPAA. But to talk about it with the class is probably a wise thing to do, without, depending on the comfort level of what's being shared, and the student, parents, all that. So you can make some inroads into assistance there. It can work if we welcome all students to the learning community. This kid has some strengths if you will get to know him, but wow, sometimes it's so tough getting to that, especially if you've got 22 or 30 other students in that class. And how do you take the time to get to know this one that's demanding so much of your time, just trying to keep them on track and keep them from blowing up or hurting somebody? So we teach professionals the techniques they need for supporting students in general education. Oftentimes we expect teachers to go in there and just know how to take care of all of these different disabilities, when for some of them the only course they've had is a survey course where they've spent 45 minutes looking at a webinar on this, and now they're expected to be experts on kids with emotional behavior disorders. We need strong administrative support, but we get into the iffy things there, because for some teachers, strong administrative support is get this kid out of my class. Where strong administrative support might be that we teach you how to deal with this kind of student, that we give you time to learn, we give you time to plan with behavior specialists and others in the district that can make your life easier. We make sure we have a good plan in place for when this kid does mess up. All of that is extremely important. But what it boils down to is enhanced knowledge and skills for teachers, how to deal with these kids. I used to say how to teach students with emotional and disturbances without becoming an emotionally disturbed teacher. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Transition. Our kiddos have a high dropout rate. Only about half will actually get a diploma. They have problems finding and keeping jobs, which is odd because they have normal IQ. Had a student one time, we got him a job. He was working a machine on a production line, and when whatever came by, he was supposed to reach up and flip the switch, and that was the extent of what he had to do. Well, he got to where that he would sit in the chair or in the stool, and then when he came by, he would flip the switch, but he would do it with his foot. He'd reach his foot up there and flip the switch with his foot. So the supervisor saw him doing that and said, you can't do that. You've got to use your hand. This is our standard operating procedure. So you need to do that. And he finally got mad about it and proceeded to take the stool and ruin the machine that he was supposed to be operating. Have the family-centered approach where we're trying to get the DJ, you on?
Uh,
This is
ah,
this is the makeup session for the one that was missed the other day. So if you want to wait, the real one will be at 7 o'clock tonight.
can you hear me?
Now I can, yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. I just didn't know. I saw it. I was like, do I need to get on? So, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
this is the makeup one. All right.
Bye.
Bye. Um, all right. So family center, these parents need help. I mean, you imagine how hard it is for you as a teacher. Well, this parent has them all day, every day. Need better access to mental health services. Those need to be coordinated with what we're doing at school. Teaching skills that enhance post-school outcomes. Like DJ wrote all over my screen. I don't know if y'all are seeing that too. Focused transition programs, helping them with vocational skills, on the job training. All of these things can help in the overall outcomes of our students. So that pretty well covers it. Lots of good information in the book, and I hope that this helped answer some questions. If you have questions, feel free to get a hold of me. Dr. Cavan's Tarleton address is Cavan at Tarleton. Well, mine is dcavan at Tarleton, because I do some adjunct work there. So I have an email address, and I'll be glad to be a resource to you if I can. So I hope everything's going well, and we'll get this posted, and we're winding her up here pretty quick. Thank y'all.